I guess people think that just because you're older or because you've lived in the same quiet corner of a small town for 40 years, you're an easy target, someone they could just push around and mold into whatever, and quote, perfect neighborhood, and quote, vision they've got swirling in their heads. But what they didn't account for was that my mom isn't just some lady in a booth at a diner. She's the woman who raised me, and they definitely didn't account for me coming home 3 days early from a deployment with the SEALs, still carrying the weight of the desert in my lungs and a whole lot of protective instinct in my heart. I'd been gone for 18 months, and when you're out there, you survive on memories of the mundane. Things like the smell of cheap coffee at Miller's Creek Diner and the way the morning light hits the chipped Formica tables where my mom, Elena, has sat every single Tuesday morning since before I was born. So when I landed at the local airstrip, I didn't oppose. Call her, I didn't oppose. Text. I just dropped my gear at the apartment of a buddy of mine and headed straight to Miller's, imagining the look on her face when I'd slide into the booth opposite her and ask if she was going to finish her blueberry muffin. But the moment I pushed through those heavy glass doors, the air didn't smell like home. It felt electric, heavy, with that suffocating silence that only happens when a room full of people is watching a car wreck in slow motion. My eyes adjusted to the dim light, and that's when I saw him. This guy in a crisp, overly aggressive tactical vest with, in quote, Oak Ridge Enforcement, in quote, stitched across the back in block letters. Oak Ridge being the new name of the neighborhood I grew up in, a name chosen by a woman named Victoria who'd moved in 3 years ago and decided our street was her personal kingdom. And this guy, this wannabe commando, had his hand physically wrapped around my mother's jaw, forcing her head back into the vinyl of the booth while he leaned over her, his face inches from hers, and he was hissing words that made my blood turn to ice, calling her, in quote, an eyesore, in quote, telling her she was, in quote, cluttering up a high-value zip code, in quote, and then he used a word for her heritage that I wanted to oppose, to even repeat, all while my mother, this woman who'd worked 2 jobs to buy me my first pair of boots, was just sitting there with her hands trembling, coffee spilling from her tip cup and soaking into her favorite cardigan. I didn't oppose. I didn't oppose. Announce myself. I just moved. And if you've never seen a man who's been trained to clear rooms move across a crowded diner, let me tell you, it's like a shadow shifting, because before anyone could even blink, I was standing right behind him, and the shift in the room was instantaneous, the silence deepening as people realized the, in quote, threat, in quote, wasn't an oppose. The old lady in the booth, but the 6'2" man in a faded hoodie who looked like he just walked out a storm. The guy, let's call him Miller because he had that generic mid-level bully energy, felt my presence and started to turn, his hand still lingering on my mom's chin for a second too long, and he started to say, in quote, hey, this is official HOA business, you need to, in quote, but he never finished that sentence because I reached out and gently, almost politely, removed his hand from my mother's face. But I didn't oppose. He let go. I just held his wrist with a grip that I knew was sending a very clear message to his nervous system that he was no longer the apex predator in the room. My mom looked up, her eyes wide and wet with tears, and the moment she realized it was me, she let out this tiny, broken sob that did more damage to my composure than any I ever could. And I just looked at Miller, whose chest was puffed out, trying to rely on that fake authority that Victoria had given him, and he had the nerve to sneer at me, saying, in quote, she's a thief. She's been stealing silverware from the diner to supplement her and Oppo's, Shack and Oppo's, down the street. And as an authorized agent of the Oak Ridge Community Association, I have the right to detain, end quote. And that was the point where I realized this wasn't Oppo's. Just a misunderstanding. It was a coordinated hit, a way to humiliate her enough that she'd finally signed the papers Victoria had been sliding under her door for months, wanting to buy our lot for pennies on the dollar to build some, in quote, modern minimalist, in quote, monstrosity. I let out a breath, a long, slow one, and I asked him very quietly, in quote, did you just put your hands on my mother? End quote. And he actually had the audacity to laugh, a dry, nervous sound, and said, in quote, I'm performing a community service, kid. Now back off before I, end quote. And that's when my fist met his jaw. Not a wild, cinematic swing, but a short, compact, clinical strike that sounded like a heavy book hitting a hardwood floor. and his head snapped back, his eyes going vacant for a split. Second, as his knees buckled, and he tumbled backward into a table of high school kids who scrambled out of the way as sugar shakers and napkin holders went flying. He tried to scramble up, his ego screaming louder than his actual injuries, and he reached for a canister on his belt. Pepper spray or a taser, I didn't in Oppos. T cared to find out, but I didn't in Oppos. T given the space, I stepped in, caught his arm, and drove an elbow into his ribs with just enough force to remind him that he was made of glass, and I was made of iron. And as he folded over, gasping for air that wooed in Oppos, T come, I whispered in his ear, and quote, "You're not a cop, you're a gardener with a radio, and if you ever look at her again, I want an Oppos. T be this nice," and quote, before I swept his legs out from under him and watched him faceplant into a puddle of spilled ranch dressing. The manager of Miller's, a guy I'd known since I was 5, was already on the phone with the real police, and as I sat down in the booth and pulled my mother into my arms, the diner started to come back to life. But it was different. People were whispering, some were filming on their phones, and I saw a woman in the corner, Victoria herself, who had apparently been sitting there the whole time, sipping a latte and watching the enforcement happened like it was some kind of dinner. Theater, and when our eyes met, she didn't end Oppos. T looked guilty. She looked annoyed, like I was an unexpected line item on a budget she had in Oppos. T approved. When the actual deputies arrived, guys who actually knew the law and didn't in Oppos, T wearing tactical vests to suburban diners. The story came out in a flood, and it wasn't in Oppos. T just about that morning, it was about the 6 months of hell Victoria and her enforcement team had put my mom through while I was away, the fines for her grass being a 1/4 inch too high. The anonymous calls to code enforcement about her porch furniture. The letters claiming her house was a biological hazard because she liked to feed the birds, and then the crowning jewel. The security footage from the diner that showed Miller walking up to her table, unprovoked, slapping a piece of paper down, and when she tried to push it away, he struck her. The deputy, a veteran himself named Harris, looked at Miller, who was currently being treated by paramedics for a broken jaw and 3 cracked ribs, and then he looked at the footage, and then he looked at me, and he didn't in Oppos. T even asked for my statement first. He just walked over to Victoria, who was trying to slip out the back door, and said, "Ma in Oppos, stay right where you are. We need to talk about conspiracy to commit assault and impersonation of a peace officer," And the look of pure, unadulterated shock on her face was worth every second of that 18-month deployment. It turns out they've been doing this to 4 other elderly residents in the neighborhood, a systematic cleansing of the original owners to make room for the new money Victoria was bringing in through a real estate firm. And she'd been using HOA dues to pay Miller and his buddies to act as her personal goon squad, thinking that since they were in private security the rules didn't in Oppos T apply. But as it turns out, the law has a very dim view of people who use fake badges to terrorize grandmothers in diners. The fallout was massive, the kind of local scandal that keeps the newspapers running for months, with Victoria facing racketeering charges and Miller heading to a state facility with a jaw wired shut and a very long time to think about his community service But for me, the victory was in Oppos. T in the jail time or the lawsuit that eventually dissolved the Oak Ridge HOA and gave my mom back her peace of mind. It was 3 weeks later when I was sitting on the porch with her, painting. The trim of the house she'd been told she had to leave, and a neighbor walked by, stopped, and just thanked us for being the ones to finally say, no, But it makes you wonder, doesn't in Oppos, how many people are out there right now, living in communities that feel more like prisons, being bullied by people who have a little bit of power and a whole lot of ego. And what happens when they're ISN and Oppos? TA's son coming home to step in, or a camera running to catch the slap. So I want to hear from you guys because I know my situation was extreme, but have you ever dealt with Karen or a fake authority figure who thought they owned the sidewalk you walked on? And did you stand your ground? Or did you have to wait for the world to catch up to their nonsense? Because at the end of the day, a uniform doesn't in Oppos T make a man, and A in quote, vision in quote, for a neighborhood, dozen in oppos. T give you the right to treat people like trash. So let's talk about it in the comments. Let's see just how deep this in quote, HOA madness in quote, really goes, and if you think I went too far with Miller, or if you would have done the exact same thing if it was your mom sitting in that booth, tell me. I'm reading every single one of them.